On July 25th, 2000, Air France Flight 4590 lifted off from Charles de Gaulle Airport and never came back down. 113 people were dead before the fire trucks reached the wreckage. The image went everywhere. A Concorde, the most beautiful aircraft ever built, trailing a wall of flame across a French summer sky. The world looked at that photograph and drew an obvious conclusion. This is what killed Concorde. But here's what nobody told you. By the time this plane hit the ground, Concorde was already dead. The crash didn't end the program. It accelerated a verdict that had already been written. And the real story of why Concorde disappeared is not a story about fire or debris on a runway. It's a story about economics, politics, and a decision made in boardrooms years before anyone ever heard of Flight 4590. A decision that the aviation industry has spent 2 decades pretending was made for safety reasons. Because what actually killed Concorde wasn't a blowout. It was the fact that 2 of the most powerful aerospace companies in the world looked at the most technologically extraordinary airliner ever flown and calculated, quietly, that it was worth more dead than alive. To understand why that calculation was made, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the crash, to the moment Concorde was born, and to the fundamental contradiction that was baked into its design from the very first day. The idea was almost reckless in its ambition. In the late 1950s, British and French aerospace engineers arrived at the same conclusion independently. The future of civil aviation wasn't just faster aircraft. It was a completely different category of aircraft. Supersonic. A plane that could cross the Atlantic in 3 hours instead of 8. A plane that would make the 707 look like a bus. In November 1962, Britain and France signed a treaty, not a memo or a memorandum of understanding, a binding international treaty, committing both governments to develop this aircraft jointly. It was the most serious aviation commitment any 2 countries had ever made to each other. What they built was genuinely extraordinary. The Concorde that emerged from that collaboration flew at Mach 2.04, twice the speed of sound, at altitudes above 60,000 feet, where the sky above turns a deep indigo and the curvature of the Earth is visible through the cabin windows. The airframe heated to over 120 degrees Celsius during cruise from aerodynamic friction alone. The nose drooped on takeoff and landing to give pilots visibility that the pointed supersonic profile otherwise blocked entirely. The aircraft stretched by almost a foot in flight as the aluminum skin expanded with heat. Every system on board operated at limits that no other commercial aircraft had ever approached. And it worked. It worked beautifully. British Airways and Air France flew Concorde commercially from 1976, the London to New York route in 3 hours and 30 minutes. Business travelers and celebrities paid extraordinary premiums to cross the Atlantic before their bodies had time to register they'd left. It was not just an aircraft. It was a statement about what human engineering could achieve when given enough ambition and enough money. And that word, money, is where the story begins to turn. Because Concorde was never, at any point in its commercial life, a financially rational aircraft. The development cost the British and French governments the equivalent of nearly $20 billion in today's money. The original plan called for selling between 200 and 300 aircraft to airlines around the world. Pan Am, TWA, Japan Airlines, Continental, Braniff, and a dozen others all signed options in the early 1960s. The order book looked extraordinary. The supersonic age seemed inevitable. Then something happened that the engineers in Bristol and Toulouse had not fully modeled. The economics of operating Concorde did not work for any airline that had to answer to shareholders. The aircraft burned 5 times as much fuel as a 707 to carry 1/5 of the passengers. That ratio, burned into every financial model ever built around the program, meant that the ticket price required to break even on a Concorde route was simply beyond what most travelers would pay. Pan Am canceled its options in 1973. Every other airline followed within months. By the time Concorde entered commercial service in 1976, the only 2 operators left were the 2 national carriers whose governments had built it and who were, by contractual and political obligation, required to fly it. British Airways and Air France didn't buy their Concordes at market price. They acquired them for a nominal sum, effectively free, because without that arrangement, there would have been no commercial service at all. The British and French governments absorbed the full development and production cost. The airlines operated the aircraft on the routes where it could actually make money, primarily transatlantic business class, and for years it worked tolerably well as a narrow commercial proposition, while being a catastrophic one as a development program. But here's the detail that changes everything. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, as Concorde aged and the world changed around it, the question of what came next began to grow louder. And the answer that emerged from that question is the real story of how Concorde died. By the early 1990s, Concorde's airframe was approaching the age at which serious decisions needed to be made. Supersonic flight creates structural fatigue at rates that subsonic aircraft never experience. The repeated cycles of heating and cooling, the stress of pressurization at altitude, the sheer violence of what the airframe endured on every single flight meant that Concorde required an engineering reassessment that no other commercial aircraft of the era faced at quite the same scale. British Airways and Air France commissioned studies. Rolls-Royce and Snecma, the engine manufacturers, conducted their own evaluations. Airbus, which by this point had absorbed the British and French aerospace establishments that built Concorde, ran the numbers. The conclusion was not that Concorde was unsafe. The conclusion was that keeping Concorde flying through the 2000s and beyond would require investment that neither government nor airline was prepared to make. A service life extension program, new components, updated avionics, structural reinforcements. The estimates ran into hundreds of millions of pounds and euros. And here was the problem. Neither British Airways nor Air France was willing to fund it, and neither the British nor French government was willing to pay for a program whose commercial case could never justify the investment. What Airbus understood, and what has rarely been stated plainly since, is that Concorde existed in a category that had no successor. Building a Concorde replacement would have cost somewhere between $20 and $50 billion. The market for supersonic travel, even in the most optimistic projections, could not absorb that investment at a price point any airline could sell. Airbus had just committed to the A380 program. Boeing was developing what would become the 787. The industry's capital was locked. There was simply no room and no appetite for a second supersonic generation. So the decision was made, not publicly, not in a press release, but in the way these decisions are always made in aviation. Quietly, gradually, by refusing to fund the programs that would have kept Concorde viable. And then the crash happened. July 25th, 2000. Continental Airlines' flight that had departed earlier left a titanium strip on runway 26 right at Charles de Gaulle. Concorde's front left tire ran over it. The tire burst. A chunk of rubber struck the underside of the wing at enormous velocity and ruptured a fuel tank. The fuel ignited. The aircraft was already at rotation speed. The crew had no viable option. They flew, and they died, along with everyone on board and 4 people on the ground. The investigation was thorough, and the cause was clear. This was not a systemic failure of the Concorde design. It was a chain of specific circumstances, beginning with debris left by another aircraft that produced a catastrophic outcome. The French Bureau d'Enquête et Analyses said so. The Civil Aviation Authority said so. Every serious technical analysis of the accident reached the same conclusion. Concorde was not inherently unsafe. It had flown for 24 years and carried more than 3 million passengers without a single fatality. The crash of Flight 4590 was a tragedy. It was not evidence of a fundamentally flawed aircraft, but the timing was devastating. And the people who had already decided Concorde's fate understood immediately what the crash meant. It meant the decision they had already made privately could now be made publicly. It meant there was a narrative available. It meant the most politically costly part of ending the program, explaining to the public why the most beautiful aircraft ever built was being grounded for good, had just been written for them. Air France and British Airways announced a temporary suspension of Concorde operations following the crash while modifications were made. New reinforced fuel tank liners, Kevlar inserts to protect against exactly the kind of rupture that had brought down Flight 590, improved tires, enhanced electrical system protection. By the autumn of 2001, Concorde was certified to fly again. It returned to service in November 2001. British Airways put it back on the transatlantic route. Air France followed, and for the next 18 months, Concorde flew again. The passengers came back, the routes performed. The aircraft, modified and recertified, was demonstrably airworthy. Anyone who argues the crash killed Concorde has to explain those 18 months. They have to explain why, if the aircraft was too dangerous to operate, it was allowed back into service at all. The answer is that it wasn't too dangerous. It was returned because the aviation authorities correctly determined it was safe, and it was then killed for reasons that had nothing to do with the runway in Gonesse. In April 2003, Air France and British Airways announced jointly that Concorde would retire from service permanently. The official statement cited the crash, the economic impact of September 11th on premium travel, and rising maintenance costs. The airline said Airbus had notified them that it would cease providing technical support for the aircraft. That last point is the one that almost nobody examined at the time, and it is the key to understanding what actually happened. Airbus by 2003 was the consolidated entity that held the type certificate for Concorde. It owned the engineering documentation, the maintenance authority, the certification data. Without Airbus providing ongoing technical support, the aircraft could not legally remain in service under aviation regulations. Airbus withdrew that support, and Airbus's reasoning, stated carefully and never fully challenged in public, was that the cost of maintaining the support infrastructure for a fleet of just 12 aircraft, 7 with British Airways and 5 with Air France, was no longer commercially justified. 12 aircraft. That was the entire surviving Concorde fleet. Against that, Airbus was running the A380 program, the A320 Neo development, and managing support obligations for thousands of aircraft operated by hundreds of airlines worldwide. The argument that 12 aircraft represented an unsustainable support burden for a company of Airbus's scale deserves more scrutiny than it ever received. Because here is what the record shows. British Airways was profitable on Concorde, not marginally, not theoretically, profitably. The airline had acquired its Concordes for next to nothing. Operating costs, while high, were covered by ticket prices that passengers paid willingly. The Concorde routes generated revenue that compared favorably with many subsonic premium services. British Airways' chief financial officer, at the time, confirmed in subsequent years that Concorde was not losing money for the airline. It was making money. The economic argument for retirement was not British Airways' argument. It was Airbus's argument. And Airbus had a specific set of incentives that are worth examining carefully. Concorde's continued operation was, in a very particular way, a problem for Airbus. Not a financial problem, a strategic one. Concorde proved every single day it flew that supersonic commercial aviation was possible, that passengers would pay for it, that it could be operated safely and profitably on the right routes. As long as Concorde flew, the implicit question of why no successor had been developed remained alive. And that question pointed directly at the decisions made in the 1980s and 1990s not to fund a second generation. Decisions made by the same institutions that had, by 2003, become Airbus. Retiring Concorde closed that question permanently. No aircraft, no demonstration, no ongoing proof of concept. Just history. There is a document that very few people outside aviation regulatory circles have ever read carefully. In 2003, a group of Concorde engineers, several of them retired from British Aerospace and Aerospatiale, the original design teams, submitted a technical assessment to the Civil Aviation Authority, arguing that Concorde's airframe had significant remaining service life if properly maintained. Their assessment put the viable extension at somewhere between 10 and 15 additional years of commercial operation, subject to the maintenance investment they specified. The CAA received the document. The CAA did not act on it. The Airbus withdrawal of type support had made the question moot. Without the manufacturer's backing, no regulatory authority could certify the aircraft for continued service, regardless of what independent engineers concluded about the airframe. Concorde's last commercial flight landed at London Heathrow on October 24, 2003. The aircraft taxied to a gate. Passengers disembarked. The airframe was towed to a position where it would never move under its own power again. Across the Atlantic, the last Air France Concorde had already made its final flight to Toulouse, where it would eventually become a museum exhibit. The aircraft that had been flying for 27 years, that had operated safely across thousands of transatlantic crossings, that had been modified and recertified after the crash, that was by independent engineering assessment structurally sound for another decade or more, simply stopped. Not because it fell from the sky, because a corporation decided to stop supporting it, and no one with the authority to challenge that decision chose to do so. And the questions that raises have grown louder with every year that has passed since. Because 2003 was not the end of supersonic commercial aviation as a concept. It was the beginning of a 20-year gap during which every lesson Concorde had taught about what supersonic travel required, what it cost, what passengers would pay, what routes could sustain it, sat unused. Boom Supersonic is now developing the Overture. NASA and Lockheed Martin have been working on the X-59 quiet supersonic demonstrator. Spike Aerospace is building the S-512. The commercial appetite for supersonic travel that Concorde proved existed is once again being treated as a discovery, a new opportunity, something the industry is only now beginning to understand. None of it is new. Concorde proved all of it, and Concorde was retired not because the technology failed, not because the market rejected it, not because the crash made it unacceptable, but because the people who controlled the infrastructure required to keep it flying decided their interests were better served by grounding it. The image from July 25, 2000, the fireball over Charles de Gaulle, is one of the most recognizable photographs in aviation history. It has been used repeatedly and deliberately to close a chapter that did not need to close. The story it tells is not wrong. A terrible accident happened. People died. But the story it has been made to tell, that Concorde was too dangerous, too expensive, too fragile to survive, is something different from the truth. Concorde was retired because the institutions responsible for its future calculated that retirement served their interests. The crash gave them the cover to say so publicly, and the aircraft that proved humanity could fold the Atlantic in half, the machine that turned 8 hours into 3, the plane that made the curvature of the Earth visible from a commercial cabin window was pushed into museums, while the people who could have saved it looked away. That is the real reason Concorde was killed. Not fire, not debris on a runway, not the economics of a changed world. A decision made in advance that the most extraordinary civil aircraft ever built was worth more as a memory than as a machine.